What American soldiers did to SS guards when they found Dachau. April 29, 1945. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division thought they had seen everything. They had fought through the mud of Italy and the blood of France. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for the gates of Dachau. What they found inside wasn't just a prison. It was a factory of death. And in that moment, as the stench of decay filled their lungs, the line between soldiers and executioners blurred. This is the story of the Dachau Liberation Reprisals, the day American soldiers looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back. Part 1. The Death Train, the First Encounter. April 29, 1945, began as a Sunday like any other on the front lines. The men of the 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division were moving through the outskirts of Munich. They had been told there was a labor camp nearby. In their minds, they expected a prison, harsh, brutal, but something within the realm of human understanding. They were wrong. As the first scouts approached the rail siding leading into the Dachau complex, the first thing that hit them wasn't a bullet. It was the smell. A thick, sweet, sickly stench of rot that seemed to cling to their uniforms and burn the back of their throats. It was the smell of death on an industrial scale. And then they saw the train. There, sitting on the tracks in the pale spring sunlight, were nearly 40 coal cars. From a distance, they looked like they were overflowing with dirty, gray laundry. But as the soldiers got closer, the laundry began to take shape. They saw a hand, a foot, a sunken face with eyes wide open, staring at nothing. These were the death trains from Buchenwald. Thousands of prisoners had been shoved into these open cars weeks earlier, with no food, no water, and no protection from the freezing rain. By the time the train reached the gates of Dachau, the cars had become rolling tombs. The soldiers stopped in their tracks. These were men who had survived the bloody beaches of Sicily and the mountain meat grinders of Italy. They had seen their best friends blown to pieces. They thought they were tough, but they had never seen anything like this. This wasn't combat. This was a massacre of the helpless. One soldier, a young private from Oklahoma, later recalled that he saw a woman's body at the top of a pile, clutching the small bundle that used to be a child. They were both skeletal, their skin a translucent gray stretched over bone. He turned away and vomited until he had nothing left in his stomach. A wave of cold, crystalline fury began to wash over the Americans. The rules of war they had been taught in boot camp started to feel like a joke. They looked at their rifles, then looked at the dead, and then looked toward the watchtowers of the camp just a few hundred yards away. The silence around the train was broken only by the sobbing of grown men and the metallic clack of bolts being cycled. The soldiers weren't just angry, they were transforming. In that moment, the German SS guards inside Dachau ceased to be enemy combatants in the eyes of the 45th Division. They became monsters. They became something that didn't deserve a trial, a cell, or even a drop of mercy. "Look at this," one sergeant hissed, his voice trembling with a rage so deep it sounded like a growl. "Look at what these sons of bitches did." As they moved past the train toward the main gate, the discipline that usually held a military unit together began to fray at the edges. The officers didn't stop them. Some officers were crying themselves. The soldiers of the Thunderbird Division began to move toward the entrance of the camp with their fingers tight on their triggers. They weren't looking to take prisoners. They weren't looking to follow the Geneva Convention. They were looking for the men who had overseen this horror. The gates of Dachau, with their cynical motto, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, loomed ahead. But for the SS guards waiting inside, the Americans weren't bringing liberation. They were bringing a reckoning. The death train was the catalyst. It was the moment the American soldier lost his innocence and found a capacity for vengeance that would shock the world. The nightmare was just beginning, and the blood was about to flow. Part 2. Inside the gates, the walking dead. The heavy iron gates of Dachau groaned as the men of the 45th and 42nd Divisions pushed through. They expected a fight. They expected the SS to defend their fortress of cruelty to the last man. But as they stepped onto the Appellplatz, the vast assembly ground, they weren't met with a hail of bullets. They were met with something much more haunting. Silence, and then a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Out of the dark, filthy barracks they started to emerge, figures that barely looked human. They were Muselmänner, the walking dead. Men who were nothing but skeletons wrapped in thin, striped rags, their skin stretched so tight over their bones, it looked like parchment. Their eyes were enormous, sunken deep into their skulls, glowing with a mix of terror and a flicker of hope that had almost been extinguished. The American soldiers who just minutes ago were screaming for blood froze. Some of them dropped their rifles in shock. These were the liberated, but they looked like ghosts that had forgotten how to die. The stench inside the camp was 1,000 times worse than the train. It was the smell of typhus, of dysentery, and of the crematoriums. As the soldiers moved deeper, they found the Brosbad, the gas chambers disguised as showers. And right next to them, the ovens. The crematoriums were still warm. In the rooms adjacent to the ovens, the Americans found piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, reaching halfway to the ceiling. Men, women, and children, stripped of their clothes and their dignity, waiting to be turned into ash. The Germans had run out of coal in the final days, leaving the evidence of their soul-crushing efficiency for the world to see. One soldier from the Rainbow Division walked into a barracks and found a man lying on a wooden bunk, too weak to lift his head. The prisoner reached out a skeletal hand and touched the soldier's M1 Garand, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. He didn't say a word. He just held on to the cold metal as if it were a holy relic. The soldier, a tough kid from Chicago, broke down and cried like a baby. He pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, but a medic stopped him. The prisoner's body was so starved that solid food would kill him. That was the moment the soldier died and something else took over. The Americans started to see the SS guards differently now. They saw the Germans in their polished black boots and well-fed faces, standing near the guard towers with their hands up, trying to claim they were just following orders. The contrast was too much. On one side, thousands of starving, dying shadows. On the other, the healthy, arrogant men who had presided over this nightmare. The rage that had been simmering at the train tracks boiled over. This wasn't war. This was a factory where human beings were processed into nothingness. The GIs looked at the piles of teeth, the stacks of clothes, and the mountain of bodies, and they felt a primitive, raw urge for retribution. Discipline didn't just bend, it snapped. Small groups of soldiers began to herd the SS guards toward the back of the camp. There were no orders given. There were no officers stopping them. In fact, many officers simply turned their heads the other way. The air in Dachau was thick with a collective understanding. These monsters cannot be allowed to walk away. The liberators were no longer thinking about the Geneva Convention or the rules of engagement. They were looking at the ovens, they were looking at the walking dead, and they were looking at their watches. The clock for the SS guards was running out. The survivors, sensing the change in the air, began to wail and cheer in a dozen different languages. They wanted justice, and the Americans, overwhelmed by a horror they would never be able to unsee, were about to give it to them. Part 3. The breaking point, the execution at the coal yard. The air inside Dachau was no longer just air. It was a thick, poisonous fog of grief and adrenaline. As the American GIs moved deeper into the camp, the sights they encountered acted like a rhythmic hammer to their sanity. More bodies, more ovens, more skeletons begging for a crust of bread. By mid-afternoon, the breaking point arrived. It happened near a coal yard, behind a long masonry wall. About 560 SS guards and camp personnel had been rounded up. These weren't the frontline soldiers who had fought the Americans in the woods. Many of these were the Totenkopf, Death's Head units, the men who ran the gas chambers and the gallows. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Cherokee officer of the 45th Division, was one of the men overseeing the prisoners. He had seen the death train. He had seen the piles of children. He, like every other man in his unit, was operating on a level of cold, white-hot fury that military training cannot account for. The SS guards were lined up against the wall. Some were defiant, staring at the Americans with the same arrogance they had used on the prisoners. Others were whimpering, realizing that the inferior Americans they had been taught to despise were now their judges and executioners. Then, someone yelled, "They're trying to break away." Whether it was a genuine attempt to escape or simply a panicked movement in the crowd, no one knows for sure. But in the powder keg of Dachau, a single spark was all it took. The chatter of an M1919 Browning machine gun shredded the silence. It wasn't a coordinated execution order. It was a spontaneous eruption of violence. Soldiers who had been standing guard simply pulled their triggers. They didn't aim for the legs. They aimed for the black uniforms. They aimed for the skulls. They aimed for the men who had turned a corner of Germany into a portal to hell. For several long, terrifying seconds, the coal yard was filled with the deafening roar of American lead hitting German flesh and brick. Dust kicked up from the wall, mixing with the blood of the SS. Guards fell in heaps, screaming, clutching their wounds, or silenced instantly. "Stop! Cease fire!" An officer yelled, finally jumping into the fray to beat the barrels of the machine guns down. When the dust settled, the scene was a mirror image of the horror the Americans had found at the train tracks. Bodies lay tangled and bleeding against the wall. The silence that followed was even more deafening than the gunfire. The GIs stood there, their barrels smoking, their faces devoid of emotion. They weren't cheering, they weren't celebrating. They were just empty. But the retribution wasn't limited to the American rifles. In another part of the camp, the soldiers did something perhaps even more symbolic. They stepped aside. They looked at the survivors, the men who had been tortured, starved, and humiliated, and they handed them their trench knives or simply pointed toward the cowering guards. "He's yours," a soldier reportedly told a group of prisoners. What followed was a primitive, raw form of justice that no court of law could ever replicate. The prisoners, fueled by years of agony, fell upon their former tormentors with anything they could find: rocks, shovels, or their bare, skeletal hands. For a few hours, the liberated became the masters, and the masters became the prey. History calls this the Dachau Massacre or the Liberation Reprisals. To the lawyers and the politicians back in Washington, it was a war crime, a violation of the Geneva Convention. But to the men who had spent that morning, smelling the burnt hair of the innocent and counting the bodies of infants, it was the only logical conclusion to the day. The line between right and wrong had been incinerated in the crematoriums. As the sun began to set over the blood-soaked yard, the soldiers of the 45th Division realized they would never be the same. They had come to Dachau as liberators, but they were leaving with a darkness in their souls that no victory parade could ever wash away. They had looked into the abyss, and for one bloody hour, they had let the abyss win. Part 4. The SS Guards, Justice or Crime. The smoke from the M1919 machine guns eventually drifted away, but the air in the coal yard remained heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the stunned silence of men who had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. By late afternoon, the initial frenzy of the 45th and 42nd Divisions had begun to cool into a numb, hollow shell shock. Around the camp, several hundred SS guards were still alive, huddling in groups with their hands interlaced behind their heads. These men, once the gods of this concrete hell, were now shivering in their black uniforms, looking at the young American soldiers not as liberators, but as the same kind of executioners they themselves had been. This created a terrifying moral vacuum. On one side stood the SS guardsmen, who had overseen the systematic starvation of 30,000 people, the gas chambers, and the medical experiments. On the other side stood the American GIs boys from Oklahoma, Kansas, and New York, who had been raised with the Bible and the Bill of Rights. For the Americans, the dilemma was agonizing. If they treated the SS according to the Geneva Convention, giving them food, water, and a fair trial, were they spitting on the graves of the children they had just found in the death train? But if they lined them all up and pulled the trigger, were they any better than the Nazis they were sent to destroy? One sergeant later wrote in his diary, "I looked at an SS guard, a man about my age. He had a picture of his wife and 2 kids in his hand, begging for his life. An hour earlier, I'd seen a pile of children's shoes near the oven. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to empty my clip into his face. But I didn't. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because I didn't want to take his filth home with me." This was the invisible Battle of Dachau. While some soldiers had already snapped and participated in the coal yard execution, others fought a desperate internal war to remain human. But for the SS, the nightmare was far from over. Even where American rifles stayed silent, the prisoners were not bound by military law. In the chaotic hours following the takeover, informal justice continued in the barracks. Prisoners identified the most brutal guards, the ones known for their cruelty with the whip or the pistol. There are accounts of American soldiers simply turning their backs, walking to the perimeter fence to light a cigarette, while the survivors took their revenge. It was a dark, unspoken agreement. The law of man has failed here, so the law of nature must take over. As more senior officers arrived on the scene, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They saw the bodies of the SS guards at the wall. They saw the blood on the coal. They realized that while they had won a military victory, they had suffered a profound moral collapse. Colonel Howard Buchner, a medical officer who later wrote about the event, estimated that nearly 500 guards were killed in those few hours, some in combat, some in cold-blooded execution, and some at the hands of the inmates. To the brass back at headquarters, this was a disaster. It was a stain on the honor of the U.S. Army, but to the men on the ground, the honor of the Army felt like a hollow joke compared to the stench of the crematoriums. They didn't see prisoners of war. They saw a plague that needed to be cauterized. The question began to circulate through the ranks, one that would haunt the survivors for the next 50 years. Was it a war crime to kill the men who ran a factory of war crimes? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the epaulettes, the Americans began to organize the camp. The SS guards who were still alive were moved into secure holding areas, shielded now by officers who realized the world would eventually ask questions. The GIs sat in the dirt, exhausted, their eyes staring into the distance. They had entered Dachau as the good guys. They were leaving as something else, witnesses to the absolute bottom of human depravity, and participants in a vengeance that was as inevitable as it was tragic. The reckoning was over. The investigation was about to begin, and the ghost of Dachau was already beginning to take shape in the minds of every man who stood in that yard. Part 5. The Ghost of Dachau, the Investigation and the Scar. By the morning of April 30th, the fury had been replaced by a cold, numbing hangover. The soldiers of the 45th and 42nd Divisions woke up in a world that had forever shifted its axis. Dachau was no longer a secret. It was a scar on the face of the earth. But for the men who had pulled the triggers at the coal yard, a new kind of battle was beginning. A battle with the law, and a battle with their own memories. The U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's office didn't take long to act. Word of a mass execution of German prisoners had reached the ears of the High Command. For the military bureaucracy, this was a nightmare. The United States had always claimed the moral high ground. If it was discovered that American GIs had committed a war crime during the liberation of a concentration camp, the propaganda fallout would be catastrophic. An official investigation was launched, led by Assistant Inspector General Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker. Whitaker arrived at Dachau while the bodies of the SS guards were still being cleared. He interviewed the witnesses. He saw the smoking machine guns. He heard the testimonies of officers who admitted to losing control. His report was scathing. He recommended that several officers and soldiers, including Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, be court-martialed for murder and violations of the Geneva Convention. The liberators were now facing life in prison or the gallows. But then, the report landed on the desk of the one man who had no patience for bureaucracy or the sanctity of SS lives. General George S. Patton. Patton, who had just been appointed the military governor of Bavaria, looked at the charges. He looked at the photos of the death train. He looked at the images of the gas chambers. And then, in a move that remains legendary in military law, Patton did something unexpected. He called the officers into his office, took the Whitaker report, and reportedly threw it into the wastebasket or burned it in his fireplace. The men who did this were not criminals, Patton essentially argued. They were soldiers who had been pushed past the limits of human endurance by a horror no man should ever see. Patton dismissed all charges. He knew that no American jury would ever convict a soldier for killing an SS guard at Dachau. He chose to protect his men, believing that the justice meted out that day, however brutal, was the only justice Dachau deserved. But while the legal files were destroyed, the mental files remained open. The soldiers of the 45th Division went home to a hero's welcome. They marched in parades, they got married, they raised families. But many of them never spoke a word about April 29th. For decades, the Dachau massacre was a dark secret, whispered only in VFW halls or late at night between brothers in arms. They suffered from what we now call PTSD, but back then, it was just the shakes or the ghost. They couldn't erase the smell of the ovens. They couldn't erase the sound of the machine gun at the wall. They had looked into the black heart of humanity, and they had found a bit of that darkness inside themselves. As the years passed, some survivors of the 45th finally began to speak, not to apologize, but to explain. They wanted the world to understand that on that day, right and wrong didn't exist. There was only the shock of the absolute evil and the visceral human response to it. Dachau today is a memorial, a place of silence and prayer. The coal yard wall is gone, and the grass grows over the spots where the SS guards fell. But the story of the Dachau Reprisals remains one of the most important lessons of World War II. It teaches us that war isn't a movie. It isn't a clean fight between good and evil. War is a corrosive force that can turn the most honorable young men into executioners if they are exposed to enough horror. The American soldiers at Dachau didn't lose their morality. They had it stolen from them by the sights they witnessed. They were the men who saw the worst of humanity and did what they felt they had to do. History may judge them, the law may condemn them. But for the 30,000 skeletons who were pulled from the brink of death that day, those American boys weren't war criminals. They were the angels of vengeance, who finally brought an end to the nightmare. The ghosts of Dachau still whisper to us, reminding us that the line between soldier and monster is thin, and that in the face of absolute evil, even the good guys can lose their way in the dark.